ban is also the lead story for The Telegraph. And likewise, it's on the front of The Guardian. The Express is also leading with the ban, as well as reporting on Trump declaring a national emergency due to the coronavirus spread. The Mail suggests doctors may go as far as making the decision to switch off certain patients' ventilators and prioritise those with better chances of survival. And the Times thinks police may go as far as detaining infected people if they believe that they pose a risk to public safety. The Mirror remarks on the large number of cancelled sporting fixtures, their headline, Game Over. And the Star gets the prize for the most sexist front page of the night, suggesting that with the football called off, men may have to talk to their wives. Wow, that's original. We're joined tonight by Polly Mackenzie and Alex Dean, and coronavirus dominating every single front page. So we're kicking off with a Telegraph. Mass gatherings to be banned. This is a bit of a reverse gear, isn't it, from what we heard from the Prime Minister two days ago?
Well, so the Telegraph, normally a big fan of the government, it calls it a U-turn, as do some of the other papers, but I'm not sure that's completely fair. When the Prime Minister was speaking and the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Officer, earlier in the week, they were clear that this was something they were considering and they would move to as and when they felt it was necessary. They said there are a balance of risks. If you cancel big sporting events and people just go to the pub, that might be a problem. And they also spelt out that the burden that falls on both policing and the NHS of mass events might cause them to ban them. And so they're now saying that next week they may then move forward to ban them. So it doesn't feel like it's not a screeching U-turn, perhaps because it has been widely criticised. The Telegraph has here a picture of the Cheltenham Gold Cup, which went ahead today, with, I think, 50 or 70,000 people. Because they've been criticised, it's possible they've accelerated, or it's possible that this was on the cards all along.
Well, that was the distinction I would make. I don't think it is a U-turn, because the government's been honest with us about the fact they're trying to smooth out this so-called curve and the bell curve of where contagion may occur, but it does feel like they've moved the timetable up quite significantly. We were talking about things like this stopping mass events being weeks or even months away, and now we learn that it's some days away. I wouldn't want this front page to pass without noting too that the Jenny Russell piece, forgive me, I'm sorry, Judith Wood's piece on the bottom of the page about how very haunting, I think, headline. How do we cope when showing our love as Russian roulette? People facing really difficult decisions about visiting elderly relatives. I think it was the Italian Prime Minister who said, it's against our nature, but please don't go and visit your senior citizen friends. A remarkable thing to have to think about.
It really is. It has been enormously sobering for everybody, I think, over the last couple of days. The mass gatherings thing, going back to that, the argument that I've heard from virologists has been that things like Cheltenham, things that are outdoors, that actually outdoors in the cold, in the fresh air, there's less chance of passing on the virus than there is, as you say, at small family gatherings.
It depends on what conditions those things happen. So apparently ski resorts, for example, are closing all over the place because you may be outdoors a lot of the time and you may be in the cold, but quite often then you're in a bubble, either in a small contained area or in a ski lift where you pull the thing down over the top and you're breathing each other's air. So there's no guarantee, actually. There are false friends here, and you think that it's going to be safe because of condition X or Y, but it's not.
Yeah, and of course people have to travel to things like Cheltenham. They may do that in a private car, but they may also do it on
a train or a bus.
On a bus, and be coughing all over others.
And if you're banning gatherings of over 500 people, you can get almost that many packed onto a train, can't you?
Yes, and of course smaller events may be important for people passing it on. I think the one thing that I'm surprised still not to see from the government is any talk around encouraging older people to cocoon or protect themselves.
Yeah.
That's not yet official advice, whereas it is in France, where everybody over 70 is being told basically not to leave the house except to buy food.
Although there was new advice today for care homes, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Yes.
People not visiting those. Onto the FT, they have characterised it as a U-turn.
I think one of the things about this discussion, though, is interesting because the Scots, of course, did this first. They banned mass events. And the argument wasn't just about how I might give you the coronavirus or vice versa. It was that we're going to have to dedicate police, emergency services, and medics to these events who are actually in these circumstances going to be needed elsewhere. And if you have enough of these events going on which require people with these skills and qualifications, then you're going to distract from the doing and the business of society. And if that's right, then the idea of contagion almost doesn't matter. I'm not being flippant, but it's almost neither here nor there whether people are more or less likely to catch things in that place or this place. It's whether the people you need to keep society running in these drastic circumstances are effectively distracted or misallocated because of the events you're talking about.
Which is also one of the key arguments about whether we should close schools, in that if you were to close schools, many people who ought to be working in our NHS might have to take time off to look after their kids. And actually keeping the kids with kids in school might be safer than having them shipped around between grandparents and neighbours and on buses all day.
Other reason we chose the FT front is one of the few to have a business story on the front page about the coronavirus, and they talk about British Airways as the example, whose chief executive has suggested this may be a crisis worse than 9/11 for the aviation industry.
Yeah, a story we've been reflecting tonight on News at 10. The Mail front page. Oh no, is it the Times? We've got the Mail and the Times. Let's go to the Mail next. Most frail may not get critical care. And this is about the dreadful calls they're saying that some doctors may have to make about who to save and who to let go.
So I think this reflects some of the stories that have been coming out of Italy, where ventilators are in such short supply that they have had to repurpose operating theatres which have ventilators for sort of intensive care beds. We've also seen reports in the UK that children's hospitals are going to be allowing their ventilators to be used for adult care or their operating theatres as well. And that's because a key factor here will be how many people can you offer respiratory support to. And of course, the normal way triage works is you help the most seriously sick first. But if that means that you're using up those ventilators on people who are probably going to die, what they are having to do in Italy is basically move down a tier to the next most seriously ill and leave those most vulnerable to die in order to protect those other people rather than leaving them for a few days until there's capacity.
A couple of other it is chilling. A couple of other aspects on the front of the Mail about how versatile our country and our systems are seeking to be in this situation. The first is the invitation to retired members of the medical profession to return to help in these drastic circumstances, which I think is a really striking call to people to pitch in and come together. And the second thing that I thought was very striking about this environment was the idea that GPs should hold all appointments by phone or video unless a physical examination is absolutely necessary. Well, interesting thing's going to happen here. When we get to the other side of this, as one day we will, whether this becomes seasonal or one-off, we will decide as a country and as an NHS whether we should stay with that, whether we should have many more video and phone conferences rather than in person. I thought that was very interesting, actually. Sometimes in these terrible circumstances, you learn lessons that go on to be applied later, and I wonder if that's going to be one of them.
Well, and perhaps another one may be home working, because so many organisations are now getting staff to work from home at the moment. If that works...
Yeah, we're also seeing innovations in court services, for example, more people being able to give evidence or appear before a court virtually. Again, if that can deliver more efficiency in our public services, that is a good thing.
Yeah.
I think a key narrative here, though, is also about people's isolation. And if everybody just turns into a sort of virtual robot only ever interacting with everybody else by machine, that probably isn't where we would like our society to end up, even if it kept us safe from viruses.
Daily Mail, one of the very few papers also to report on the front that our elections have been postponed until next year. The Electoral Commission, of course, recommended that a few days ago. The Conservative Party in government, coincidentally on 50% of the polls and with a very strong lead, didn't confirm that for a couple of days and then came to confirm that now. So we know that we're not actually going to go to the polls until next year.
OK, let's take a quick break now. Coming up in part 2, we're going to find out whether or not we know someone who gets sick, how the pandemic is sure to have more of an impact on our daily lives. Now, Polly Mackenzie and Alex Dean. One story dominating all of the front pages tonight, COVID-19. Let's look at the Eye's take on it. The UK putting life on hold, it says. The picture there, though, shows a tube carriage with lots of people in it. people are putting their life on hold if they're able to, or if they have their symptoms, but the rest of us have to crack on working.
So one of the reasons we chose this front page was the request that's been made of businesses to introduce new working practices and to change the way that they approach their staffing needs. You're right that this photograph shows many people on the tubes, but many other photographs show that the tubes in London are pretty much deserted. The city certainly felt quieter today, not a ghost town by any means, but I think as this thing goes on, the expectation is next week, as more and more people are working from home, that'll be ever more the case. And there's no doubt that people are asking businesses and those who are responsible for managing others to try to either be versatile in the way that you ask some people to come into the workplace in shift patterns, or to have everyone work from home if possible and if they can do it. There are some major things this raises questions about. The first of all, of course, being how we look after those who are self-employed and those who are in small businesses who simply can't cope doing that. And I thought the Chancellor made some big statements in the budget about what the government was going to try to do to fix that. But for some businesses that need money now, the promise of a fix later isn't reassuring.
Especially for the travel industry, which, it can't put its life on hold. It seems to be really struggling, doesn't it?
Yes.
The Mirror, its front page is focusing on sport. Game over, football, rugby, London Marathon, golf, all postponed.
Yeah, we talked just before the break about the Cheltenham Gold Cup, which basically is one of the biggest sporting events for probably the next few months. President Trump has been talking to the Premier of Japan about the Olympics, so they didn't officially discuss whether they would be cancelled. And of course, just as Alex is saying about small businesses that might be most affected, it's the smaller football, rugby clubs that will be most affected by these shutdowns, the most reliant on ticket prices. So there's quotes here in the Mirror. They've got a whole double-page spread all about the impact on the game. So Dale Vince, chairman of League Two club Forest Green Rovers, which, forgive me, I hadn't heard of before, but says it will blow a hole in their finances. Shrewsbury Town says it could cost them £250,000.
And
devastating.
That kind of amount is very serious for clubs of this size. I'm not saying for my club, Ipswich. Our Premier League, the average club, gets about 13% of its take from the gate. So, of course it matters if people aren't in the stadium, but it's not the crippling thing. For smaller clubs, the gate can be the majority of your income, and the overwhelming majority of it. That's when it really matters. And that's why I think it's very interesting the way that the Mirror has gone big today on the impact on sports, because people may think of sports simply as being fun, but for very, very many people, and not just top-end celebrities, it's their livelihoods. And they are right up at the sharp end, right with the travel industry, in those who are going to be most affected.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mirror's got quotes from the UK hospitality saying people using pubs and restaurants down 26%. Hotel bookings for the next 2 months have crashed by 50%. No amount of home working can protect those industries.
No, exactly.
And there will need to be really urgent support for them.
Yeah, I will. The final one you've picked is the inside of the Mail, the virus Q&A. We've been doing this on Sky throughout the week. We've
Sure.
had a panel of experts twice a day and putting viewers' questions to them. And this is writ large, really, isn't it?
Super interesting, not least the way that the Mail tries to puncture some of the myths that people are peddling about the coronavirus. One being, if you can hold your breath for 10 seconds without struggling, you don't have coronavirus. Myth, right? But reality, a hot bath will not raise somebody's body temperature, which stays almost constant. So some people are not having hot baths because they're afraid that they won't be able to take their temperatures properly, and therefore gauge whether or not they've got the coronavirus. Not the case.
And there are also people selling real kind of quack remedies online. Bleach will kill the coronavirus, right? But it doesn't mean you should drink it.
No.
Yeah.
People should follow the experts.
Another myth, there are people sucking saline water, so salt water, up their noses to try and fix the infection. I'm afraid, whilst deeply unenjoyable, that is not going to help.
That's your important takeaway from this evening's papers. Thank you very much, both of you. Let's take a look at the weather. And the Star has perhaps the most questionable front page of the night, suggesting that with the football called off, men might have to talk to their wives. Joined tonight by Polly Mackenzie and Alex Dean. Let's get a look through them. Let's start with the Times. It's got quite an arresting image on its front page, hasn't it? A passenger on the tube yesterday, keeping their sense of humour alive, it says. They've got their headphones on over their gas mask.
Yeah, it might look funny, but of course, for some people that's going to be quite an alarming image. And you'll see right next to it, there's the "Why are our children so anxious?" A parent's guide. Quite an interesting juxtaposition. You think about all of the things we've seen about the remarkable headlines, many of them, of course, justified, about what's happening in this country at the moment and what the state is doing. It may feed into some of that anxiety that children today feel, I think, told more generally about the climate and other things, that basically the world's going to hell. I think it's actually a good time to reflect on why children are so anxious, and maybe we've got some responsibility for it.
He's got his glasses on over his gas mask as well.
And possibly the world's worst rucksack that we can't see the rest of it. It doesn't look...
Yeah, we're assuming it's a man, but it's quite a floral rucksack. He's either...
Who knows? But the Times goes through a range of emergency powers that are, we think, still being considered, but being put together in draft legislation, including the power for police to detain for a limited period, it doesn't specify how long, people suspected of having coronavirus. Sounds like a useful power, possibly, perhaps for use at airports. Also a power that you can imagine being horribly misused. You know, you cough once in front of a police officer, suddenly you're up against the wall and, you know, detained for several hours. But I hope that our police will be well regulated in their use of it. There's also, I think, from social media that inside the Times, which we don't have yet, suggestions that councils might be released from some of their legal obligations to look after elderly people. For example, meeting their assessed needs is the kind of technical term. So they might have to only drop in on them for help with washing and dressing once a day instead of twice a day. Now, of course, it's not much use being got dressed in the morning if nobody's going to help you get back into your pajamas and get back into bed. So I think we need to think incredibly serious. The missing plank of the government strategy thus far is, what are they going to do about millions of older people who, either because of government advice or because of their own caution or because of their care needs, are going to be trapped at home, advised not to visit them in order to protect them, and the government, in order to, focus on the NHS, may actually withdraw help. We cannot leave our elderly people at home alone to suffer through this.
Yeah, I completely agree about the elderly, so I'll just say one thing on this police point. You were suggesting we must hope that our police exercise these powers judiciously, but when given powers, those who hold them all inevitably use them, and they inevitably use them to the fullest extent that they can. The only real way to curtail those things is to have stringent things in place and for those powers to lapse after a time. We must be very careful in times of crisis that we don't grant powers we then forget to take back after. I accept that these may be situations in which we need extreme things to be granted. After all, we've heard stories in Italy of people who were patients who were told to stay in their homes who didn't and went out and infected whole other parts of their communities. And plainly, the state's got to be able to do something to prevent that kind of harm being done to population at large. But we've got to be desperately careful to ensure that we don't allow those powers to hang over us, as they do often after crises, for years.
Yeah, the suggestion is that these powers would last for 2 years. I think that sounds to me as if it is too long, certainly if they're not going to be regularly scrutinised and reviewed by a democratic parliament.
Renewable monthly, for argument's sake, basis.
The Guardian's front page, it too, interesting juxtapositions, mass gatherings banned, but also at the top, best music, TV and films to watch if you're at home, comfort food, everybody snuggling down for the next few weeks. This mass gatherings thing, do you think it's actually useful? Do you think that mass gatherings have been shown to really spread it?
I'm not an epidemiologist. I've heard all of the arguments. There are arguments that suggest that people, if they're outdoors at large events, are not that likely to spread this illness. There are arguments that if people are told they're not allowed to go to these events, they might do other things, like go to the pub or hang out with friends and family, that might lead to further spread. But lots and lots of other countries are banning mass gatherings, and certainly the UK, in not taking this action, has looked like a real outlier. The US response has been patchy. And of course, it's brave for politicians. I mean that in sort of yes minister kind of way. It's brave to be the outlier. We might be right. And it might be that we look back in a year and realise that this was a devastating mistake. The government has come under pressure for delaying that any constraint on mass gatherings, and it now looks like they will be considering over the next few days bringing those restrictions in.
But I still don't think those who've been giving that advice, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor and co, have resiled from anything they've said. I think actually the government's grounds for banning mass events are different. The government's position is that it saps strength from the police, the NHS, our people who we trust to help in times of crisis, if they are simultaneously having to be at these mass events. So actually, I don't think the government's conceded on the point about mass gatherings not necessarily being a contagion point. That, as far as I understand it, is not the basis on which they've stopped.
But haven't they given in the face of the fact that that people are self-cancelling, the football's being cancelled?
Well, yeah, lots of people.
That if all these organisations start cancelling,
you say that
the government looks a little foolish.
Cheltenham went ahead, and we have huge packed crowds going out for horse racing. So I think the truth is, some organisations will cancel, some crowds won't go. But left to their own devices, some British people will say, keep calm, carry on, and we'll go to those things. So no, actually, I don't think it will be entirely self-policing. And if the government does want mass events to not happen, they're going to have to stop them.
The Telegraph is also leading with that point, mass gatherings to be banned. And as you say, referencing Cheltenham there's a picture of the Cheltenham Festival on the front. Just a slightly separate point, does coronavirus sell papers? Do we know?
Yes, but I think all crises sell papers and make people tune into the news. Certain news networks did very well out of the trial of Michael Jackson, which I thought was thoroughly uninteresting watch, but some people sat home and watched it all day.
Hey, I was out there. I sat and watched it for 6 months.
No offence meant, sorry. Sorry, okay. Sorry,
media plays an incredibly important role in our society at times like this, right? You are running all these infographics and data and advice on the Sky, and BBC are doing the same. All of the newspapers are full of it, reinforcing the messages, which are, of course, also out there on government websites and on billboards. I think people are hungry for information because this is a real crisis, but an incredibly slow-moving crisis. And therefore, absolutely, people want more information. And I think it's brilliant that our journalists, alongside experts, are mostly sticking with sharing that evidence, information and insight, with the occasional sort of slightly mad thing from somebody with, saying, oh, I had it and it was fine, which I think we could do with less of.
I think it's one of those amazing stories where something that's truly international, so a global news story, feels like it's absolutely to do with me. It's to do with the individual. It affects my life and my mum, my dad, people that I know. And that's when people really are fascinated by what's happening in the news, because it feels like the next stage of the story could be next day in my office, in my town, in my workplace, in my family. That's when people are really grab the newspapers like this.
The paper's probably a little bit late to include Donald Trump as well. Obviously, he spoke in the last couple of hours, saying that he could put the UK on his list of banned countries, also declaring a national emergency in America. How do you think he's played it?
Well, releasing a significant amount of funds is the result of declaring a national emergency. I think it's $50 billion US dollars that is freed up by that declaration. It's like when something's declared a pandemic or something's a communicable disease or notifiable disease in the UK law, your insurance arrangements change. In the same way it changes money significantly. I think that President Trump, who is a figure of extremes, has underplayed the risk of coronavirus for some time. We run the risk now of him overplaying the risk. Of course, everything is seen through the prism of the forthcoming US presidential election, which, with the no offense to Democrats, he seemed until recently to be very likely to win, given the state of the US economy. There is, I detect, a certain amount of panic in the position from Republican strategists as they realise that suddenly coming up the rails, a much more plausible candidate in Joe Biden than they ever thought they might face in Bernie Sanders, at the same time as the US economy is doing far worse than they were expecting.
Right, let's take a quick break. Lots more of the papers to come through in the second part, including what differences we're going to notice in our daily lives as this story of the pandemic unfolds. We'll talk about the inside pages, all of the papers leading on coronavirus. The Eye, it's pointing out that the UK is putting its life on hold, that mass gatherings are going to be banned, more people working from home, and that Europe is at the epicenter.
I think so many of the papers are kind of basically taking this, there's so many headlines to go around. You know, that we saw The Guardian with all these different boxes all over the front page with all the different things that you need to know. The Eye has gone one step further with basically its entire front page as a series of bullet points. But it's because so much is changing, you know, from home working for businesses, mass gatherings, Trump declaring a state of national emergency. Everywhere you look, our lives are being affected by this. And, you know, today is not a day where we're talking enormously about the economy. The papers on their front aren't really talking about business. And yet, we have lost £246 billion simply from the FTSE 100 over the last week.
I would say that we haven't put life on hold. I'd say we're trying to. It's very difficult to get out of some habits. You know, you're working from home, but I'll just nip out or just nip to the office. I watched the footage of Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, announcing that from today they were not going to shake hands. And then he shook the hands of the guy who was introducing him. These habits are very difficult to break. And I also won't socialise with people, but I'll just go and see how mum and dad are getting on. It's very difficult to do that. And I think we're one stage before putting life on hold. We're at the stage of thinking about putting life on hold. We haven't really got it right yet.
I think especially if you've got young children, you don't want to change their lives too much. You don't want to alarm them. You know, you just want life to continue as normal. But if we look at some of the images from inside the Mail, it does appear that quite a lot of people seem to be putting their lives on hold.
I think the key thing is, even though the government hasn't told us all to stay at home, told us to stop going to work, or yet banned mass events, so many people are acting as if that's about to happen, and they need to be prepared, and almost they need to be prepared for a kind of couple of years of lockdown. So we have these empty shelves where, you know, there's no toilet paper, despite the fact there is no problem with the supply of toilet paper. It's just that now everyone is hoarding it. You know, I was at the supermarket earlier. There was no pasta in 4 supermarkets that I tried. No pasta of any kind. And you just think, what's wrong with us all that we can't just manage to take risks and wait for the worst to come? We all
It brings out the worst in some people.
It does, and people are doing that kind of rushing and buying up stuff who could perfectly well wait or realise they've only got 2 weeks at max to be self-isolated. And all they're doing is they're impacting a little old lady who doesn't know how to shop online or doesn't shop online, who now can't buy the goods they wanted. I would make the point, though, that these are... Of course, panic buying is caused by idiots, rather. In this example, there's nothing wrong with the stock. There's nothing wrong with the product. It's individual behaviour that's caused it. But people, nevertheless, there are still lots of shops that have stuff. And journalists in this example, no offence to them, have gone out to find those images, have gone out to find those supermarkets.
Well, exactly.
There are other supermarkets that are
just been
stocked.
saying, Maya, that he was at Glasgow Airport this morning and it was busier than he's ever seen.
I went through St Pancras this week. It was busy. I was in the city today. It was busy. Now, these pictures aren't doctored, but nevertheless, people have gone out and got out of their way to find a moment and find a time and a place when things look empty. It may well be that our cities become very empty, but right now, they don't actually look like this. And there's something a bit questionable about portraying them as if they do.
Okay, it's like those shots that you used to get when the football was on and you had to go out onto the streets to see how quiet it was. But inside the Mail also, they've done a question and answer session, your vital questions answered, and there is an appetite. You were just saying the last hour, Polly, that there is still a real appetite for information about this, factual information that people can rely on.
Yeah, do you know, the one question they haven't answered in this amazingly comprehensive set of Q&As is, why does everybody have a different picture of the virus? Because this one seems to have a bunch of miniature plungers. Some of them have got sort of fuzzy things.
All a bit out of Doctor
Some of them look a bit like cauliflower.
I know, of course, it's because these are all really artist impressions or electron microscopes, all sorts of things. Nevertheless, I think we need some brand consistency about what this nasty enema of ours really looks like.
From this interesting Q&A, I think the one thing I stress in the takeaway is, question, what does this strategy mean for me? Answer, for most people, it's a case of carrying on as normal and washing your hands more often. That's it.
It is. Wash your hands, wash your hands. You can only say it so many times. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Polly and Alex, thanks very much for coming in. Good to see you both.
The weather, sponsored